Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, fluff your pillow, and let your brain slowly slide into that soft, pre-sleep fog where you forget what day it is, but somehow still remember the theme song from a cartoon you watched once in 1998. Tonight, we're drifting through a story that isn't medieval and doesn't include a single inbred Habsburg, but does involve confused men, questionable decision-making, and the kind of bureaucratic chaos that absolutely could put you to sleep. So really, it fits the channel perfectly. Because tonight, we're gently unpacking the extremely foggy, deeply disorganized, and historically over-mythologized disappearance of what people dramatically call Flight 19. 5 planes, 14 airmen, one missing rescue plane for good measure because, of course there is. No jump scares, no drama, just a slow, steady wander through a U.S. Navy training disaster that somehow ended up blamed on aliens, time portals, and whatever the Bermuda Triangle is supposed to be. So take a deep breath, let your shoulders drop, and tonight, let's drift back to a December afternoon in 1945, when a group of pilots headed out for what was supposed to be a simple practice flight and instead managed to create the most famous oopsie in naval aviation history. Now, before we get to the actual disappearance, we need to set the scene. And the scene is Florida. So yes, things were already heading in a questionable direction. It was just months after World War II had ended, and the U.S. military was basically like a very tired parent cleaning up after a huge birthday party. Soldiers were being discharged by the hundreds of thousands, equipment was being shuffled around, training bases were still running, but everyone was either exhausted, distracted, or extremely done with everything. One of those bases was Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, which trained pilots on the Grumman TBM Avenger. A big, sturdy, torpedo-carrying airplane designed to hit ships, survive damage, and generally be the blue-collar worker of World War II aircraft. It was not sleek. It was not pretty. It flew like a heavy refrigerator with wings. But it got the job done. NAS Fort Lauderdale trained pilots in navigation, formation flying, and all the fun little details you needed to not crash into the ocean, which, in theory, was a great idea. In practice, well, Flight 19 happened. Let's glide over to a calm, steady introduction of the man who would ultimately be blamed for the whole thing, Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor. Taylor was the instructor for this mission. He was 28 years old, a seasoned combat veteran, and exactly the kind of man people in the 1940s would confidently describe as handsome, even though he mostly looked like a slightly frazzled high school math teacher who just realized he left an entire stack of ungraded quizzes at home. He'd flown in the Pacific during the war. He knew the Avenger inside and out. He had more than 2,500 flight hours. He was qualified, experienced, and trusted. He also, and I say this with love, had a bit of a reputation for getting lost. Not in a dramatic into the mountains for 3 days living on berries kind of way. More like, oops, this doesn't look like Miami. This looks like maybe Cuba? Oh well. He was not bad, just directionally challenged. Some people shouldn't be allowed to navigate without Google Maps. Taylor might have been one of them. But the Navy needed instructors and he was there, so boom, instructor. Now, Flight 19 itself was a normal training mission. 5 TBM Avengers, 14 men total. Students, trainees, and Taylor leading them. Their assignment was navigation problem number 1, which sounds like something your math teacher assigns when they feel petty. But no, it was a basic triangular route. First, head east for practice bombing. Then, turn north for 67 miles. Then, turn southwest and return home. Nice. Simple. Elegant. Like a triangle drawn by a geometry student who's trying to impress the teacher. Nothing about this plan should have gone wrong. But let's take a moment to appreciate that this is a U.S. military training exercise. in the 1940s. Of course, it went wrong. The weather was fine. Cloudy patches here and there, but nothing intense. The ocean looked calm. The airfield was calm. Everything was calm. The kind of day where you would expect absolutely nothing to happen, which is usually when everything happens. Taylor was late to the briefing, just casually strolling in like someone who was already given up on impressing his commanding officers. He also didn't bring his personal navigation board or his watch, which in aviation terms is basically like showing up to your first day at a new job without pants. But Taylor shrugged it off. He was the instructor. He knew the route, he knew the drill. And thus, 14 men walked out to their planes thinking everything was totally fine. At 2:10 p.m., all 5 Avengers took off. They climbed smoothly over the coast, humming their way out into the Atlantic. The air was clear, the sun was bright, the planes were packed with fuel. You know, classic before things go terribly wrong atmosphere. The first leg of the mission, the bombing exercise, was textbook. The trainees dropped practice bombs at the hens and chicken shoals, a shallow patch of water that apparently has a name conjured by someone who was either bored or extremely hungry. Everything was tidy. The planes regrouped. Taylor turned them north for the next leg of the triangle. And then, somewhere between that neat little turn and 3:45 p.m., the vibe decided to collapse. Because at that moment, a voice crackled through the radio. A not quite panicked, but definitely, I think we've made a slight mistake, student voice. This is FT3. I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after the last turn. Which is not what any instructor wants to hear. But whatever. It happens. Pilots lose track. That's fine. Except Taylor then got on the radio and said, "Both my compasses are out. I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale. I'm sure I'm in the Keys." And the entire training tower staff went, "The Keys? No, you're not." Because the Keys are southwest of Florida. Flight 19 was not southwest. Flight 19 should have been northeast of the base. The only way Taylor could have reached the Keys was if he'd taken a dramatic, unnecessary, absolutely chaotic wrong turn. Spoiler, he hadn't. He just thought he had. Which is a small problem when you're leading 4 student pilots who trust you with their entire existence. From this point on, Flight 19 started drifting into a kind of aviation group therapy session where everyone is confused, no one knows the map, the radio is full of static, and it's getting dark outside. Students told Taylor they were over open ocean. Taylor insisted he saw land. Someone suggested checking the sun's position. Static swallowed the conversation. Just imagine 5 huge metal planes puttering around in the sky while a mildly panicking instructor keeps going, "No, I'm definitely in the Keys," while clearly not being anywhere near the Keys. The tower personnel kept trying to talk him down, reminding him to trust his instruments. But Taylor didn't trust his instruments. He trusted his gut. And his gut was wrong. He repeatedly changed directions, ordered turns, reversed the turns, unreversed them, repeatedly contradicted himself. It was like trying to follow a GPS that keeps switching languages. The weather started falling apart around 4:30. Showers drifted in, clouds thickened, light faded. Meanwhile, the Avengers were burning fuel like they were being paid to. Taylor eventually did give the correct order, heading west, but then walked it back. He thought if he kept going west, they'd hit the Gulf of Mexico. And to be fair, that would be a concern if he were actually anywhere near the Gulf of Mexico. He wasn't. He was east, still east, in the Atlantic, getting further east by the minute. This is why navigational training is a thing. By 5:50 p.m., it was getting dark. By 6, the planes were low on fuel. By 6:20, the final transmissions were coming in like soft static lace whispers. We can't hold this formation. If we don't get land soon, we're going to ditch. And then, faintly, it looks like we're entering whitewater. We're completely lost. The radio went quiet. 5 planes disappeared into the dark. Not with drama, not with explosions, just gone, like a candle slowly burning out. Now, you'd think one disappearance in a day would be enough for the U.S. Navy, but no. Because when Flight 19 didn't return, the Navy launched rescue aircraft, specifically 2 PBM Mariner flying boats, basically giant metal whales stuffed with fuel. One of those rescue planes also vanished. Yep. The PBM took off, flew towards where Flight 19 was last believed to be, and then simply never arrived. A ship nearby reported a bright flash in the sky, likely an explosion since the PBM was notorious for being what experts politely call a fire-prone gas balloon with wings. All 13 men were never found. So now the total missing was 27. And the legend was officially born. Search efforts went on for days. Ships combed the water. Planes flew grid patterns. The Navy, the Coast Guard, even civilian boats went looking. They found nothing. Not a floating cushion, not a piece of wing, not a scrap of metal. Nothing. The ocean, apparently, had entered its "I'm not explaining myself today" mood. And that empty silence is what turned Flight 19 from an aviation accident into a cultural myth. Because people do not like unexplained things, especially not when they involve multiple planes, confused radio chatter, and a part of the ocean that already has a reputation for being sketchy. Thus, the Bermuda Triangle. Thus, alien abduction theories. Thus, time travel portals. Thus, your uncle who insists the government is hiding mermaids. But the actual story? Just humans, just weather, just navigational mistakes, and a whole lot of ocean. Yet even the Navy's own report eventually threw its hands up and wrote the now famous line, "It was as if they had flown to Mars." A line so dramatic, the Navy later removed it for being unhelpfully theatrical, which is fair, but also iconic. We're still floating in the warm haze of post-war Florida aviation confusion. So let's just ease ourselves back into the story like someone slowly sinking into a beanbag chair that should have been replaced 4 years ago. When we left off, 5 Avenger planes had vanished into the Atlantic. One rescue plane had done its best impression of, "Now you see me, now you don't." And the U.S. Navy was looking at its radio logs like a student staring at a test they absolutely did not study for. So tonight, let's drift a bit deeper. Softer tone, slower narration, still gently roasting everyone involved because, the sleepless historian way. Now, before we get into conspiracy theories or the whole maybe it was aliens, maybe it was just math problems debate, we need to return to the human side of Flight 19. Because behind the disappearing planes were actual people. And shockingly, they were not flawless navigational prodigies. Most of the crew were students in advanced aviation training. That sounds fancy, But advanced here mostly meant they've been flying long enough that the instructor trusts them not to flip the plane upside down for fun. But let's glide through a few of them, quietly, gently, with the mild sarcasm of a historian who doesn't quite believe that any of these men should have been left alone with a compass. Ensign Joseph Bossy. Bossy was one of the youngest, not particularly notable, except that his friends described him as quiet, capable, and usually correct about directions, which, ironically, did not matter that day. At least one student, possibly Bossy, was the first to call out that they were lost. You can almost imagine him politely raising his hand mid-flight. Sir, this all looks wrong. Which it was. Completely wrong. He was ignored. Classic student experience. Captain Edward Powers. Powers was a Marine aviator temporarily assigned to the training program. He had combat experience. He had discipline. He had a sense of direction. Absolutely none of this helped. He reportedly argued calmly, respectfully, for Taylor to turn west several times. Taylor said no. You know how sometimes you're in a car and the driver refuses to admit they took a wrong turn, even though Google Maps is screaming at them and the scenery has gone from suburb to suspiciously rural farmland? This was that. Just at 6,000 feet, over the ocean, with fuel slowly evaporating. Captain George Stivers. George was a Marine. Marines are famously stubborn, but also famously obedient to the chain of command, meaning he knew things were going badly, but he followed Taylor anyway because that's what Marines do. Imagine being trapped in a group project where the group leader is absolutely confident and absolutely incorrect, and everyone else just sighs internally and goes along because it's easier. That was Stivers. Ensign George Devlin. Devlin was young, optimistic, and probably not expecting that his navigation course would become an unsolvable existential riddle over the Atlantic. He was one of the pilots who told Taylor, "We are not in the Keys." Which, yeah, they were definitely not in the Keys. But again, his concerns drifted into the void of ignored student input. Now, when you put all these personalities together, you get the perfect storm of group dynamics. A confident instructor who thinks his compass is broken, 4 junior pilots who think he is wrong, and a Navy radio system with the audio quality of a soggy paper cup. This is how history happens, not through brilliant decisions, but through gentle, progressively worsening confusion. Let's drift over to the instrument issue, because people love to blame the compassings. Were the compasses actually broken? Short answer, maybe. Long answer, probably not. Longest answer, even if one was broken, the other 4 planes had working ones. And yet, nobody broke formation. Students followed Taylor even when they disagreed. This wasn't because they were obedient sheep. It was standard procedure. Formation flights are about sticking together. The only thing worse than 5 planes getting lost is 5 planes getting lost individually. So sticking with Taylor wasn't stupidity, it was protocol. Just tragically unhelpful protocol. Let's float back to the ground for a moment where radio operators were having the worst shift of their careers. The tower kept hearing fragments of messages. Sometimes it was students saying they were over water, sometimes Taylor saying he saw land, sometimes static, sometimes nothing. At one point, Taylor said something like, "I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale," which is not really something you want your instructor to say, ever, but especially not mid-flight. The tower begged him to turn west. Begged. He refused. They told him to fly toward the setting sun. He hesitated. Every time a correct decision was within reach, something, Taylor's instincts, radio issues, stubbornness, fear, nudged him away from it. History isn't always a single dramatic mistake. Sometimes it's a soft, slow-motion collapse of small choices nudging each other into disaster. By the time the sun set, the planes were probably far east of their training area, maybe as far as the Bahamas, maybe further. The ocean at night is just black. No landmarks, no reference points, no soft glow of city lights, just void. For a pilot, that void is disorienting. The horizon blends with the water. Depth perception fades. Even a trained pilot can lose the sense of up and down. And they were running out of fuel. Low fuel means choices become very simple. Find land or prepare to ditch a heavy plane into cold, dark waves. Neither option is relaxing. But since they couldn't find land, ditching was the only ending. Now, let's gently float toward the calmest, sleepiest part of this tragedy, their search operation, also known as the Navy saying, "Absolutely not. We refuse to accept this." Within hours, dozens of ships and aircraft were launched. Search grids were organized. Airmen scanned the sea until their eyes hurt. It was one of the largest searches in naval history, and it found absolutely nothing. Some people say this is mysterious, but let's remember the Atlantic is large, stormy, deep, and really good at hiding things. The Avengers were made of metal. They sink fast. If they broke apart on impact, debris could scatter within minutes. Even the best search teams can miss things at sea. It's like looking for a missing contact lens in a swimming pool during a thunderstorm at night. So the fact that nothing was found doesn't necessarily point to a supernatural cause, just the ocean being the ocean. Of course, humans don't like simple explanations. We've always preferred stories that are larger, stranger, and more dramatic than reality. So let's drift very softly into the early days of the Bermuda Triangle myth. The Bermuda Triangle, a region that decided to become famous for no reason. The term Bermuda Triangle didn't even exist in 1945. Nobody cared about triangle-shaped ocean lore until the 1950s and 60s, when writers needed something spicy to sell magazines. The idea of a mysterious region devouring ships and planes was simply too marketable to resist. People love triangles. They love mystery. Combine both, boom, bestseller. So Flight 19 got scooped up into the narrative like a confused, unconsenting character in a fantasy novel. Writers claimed a strange fog swallowed the planes, time warped, magnetic fields reversed. Aliens were bored that afternoon. Atlantis reached up and unplugged the aircraft. A vortex opened, because why not? None of these theories involve things like tired pilots or navigation errors, because those are boring and the 1960s were allergic to boring. Thus, Flight 19 became folklore, shoved into the Bermuda Triangle story whether it fit or not. Spoiler, it did not. Now let's float very gently to the TBM Mariner rescue plane. This is the one that basically decided to explode for no particular reason. The PBM had a nickname among pilots, the Flying Gas Tank. It was filled with aviation fuel, a lot of aviation fuel. Some engineers believed the design was, how do we put it kindly, slightly flammable. So when witnesses saw a flash over the water that night, everyone pretty much agreed. Yeah, that thing blew up. It wasn't mysterious. It was unfortunate, but also kind of expected. Imagine trying to rescue people while flying a giant metal balloon full of gasoline, and then the universe just goes, nope. And that was the end of the PBM. Now, even though the Navy ultimately declared cause unknown, their internal notes make it clear what they probably believed. Taylor got lost, thought he was somewhere he wasn't, refused to turn west, led 5 planes further into the Atlantic, fuel ran out, everyone ditched, the ocean swallowed the evidence. Not glamorous, not paranormal, not triangle related, just human fallibility, wrapped inside human protocol, wrapped inside a very large sea. But that's the thing about history. We like clean stories. We like answers. Flight 19 gave nobody answers, just silence. And silence makes room for imagination. And as you're getting comfortable, maybe you're breathing slowing a bit, let's drift to one more quiet idea. Sometimes mysteries stay mysterious simply because nobody was alive to explain them. If Taylor had landed safely, if the trainees had returned, if even one plane had been found floating, the story would have been solved, reports written, questions answered. No triangles, no aliens, no decades of cable TV documentaries narrated by men with overly dramatic voices. But nobody came back, and the ocean doesn't file reports. So we're left with an absence. And humans fill absences with stories. Which is why Flight 19 became the legend it is. So let's drift back into the strange, slow-moving haze over the Atlantic. Picture it again. 5 FM2 Avengers wandering in a sky that is somehow too bright and too empty at the same time. The kind of white, washed-out horizon where north, south, and what even is life anymore all look exactly the same. And in the middle of all this, we still have poor Lieutenant Taylor, the man who, bless him, was absolutely convinced he was hundreds of miles away from where he actually was. The guy was basically the physical embodiment of asking for directions, but rejecting every answer given. The radio operators on the ground were at this point shifting between mild confusion and that slow-building dread you get when you realize the group project leader has no idea what he's doing. They kept sending instructions like, fly due west, just turn left, land literally anywhere. But Taylor's replies stayed hauntingly consistent. We're not where you think we are. One might call this confidence. One might also call it a stubborn commitment to being wrong. Anyway, Flight 19 kept drifting deeper into the void like a sad, angry flock of confused mechanical birds. Let's float forward a little. By around 6 p.m., the sun was sliding down, slowly drowning the sky in that dim, grayish-blue twilight that makes everything feel slightly more cinematic and slightly more doomed. One of the pilots in the group sounded like he had finally hit the acceptance stage of grief, quietly mentioned they were running low on fuel. And their planes weren't exactly known for sipping fuel gently. These were Avengers. Big, clunky, wartime machines that drank aviation gas like they were being judged in a competition. Back on the ground, Navy radio stations were doing that classic military thing of arguing with each other through increasingly formal wording. They didn't know which station had the strongest transmission, they didn't know who Taylor could hear clearly, if anyone, and in a very typical twist, some stations had working receivers, but broken transmitters. Others had working transmitters, but broken receivers. It was basically the 1945 version of trying to join a Zoom call with 2% battery and terrible Wi-Fi. Let's gently drift ahead again. By around 6:30 p.m., the messages from Flight 19 were growing weaker. The signal faded in and out like a tired sigh. And yet, even as the horizon dimmed, Taylor's sense of direction did not improve. He reportedly said, "If we just headed west, we would get home." Which, ironically, is exactly what everyone told him to do 2 hours ago. But now it was too late. The planes were running on fumes. The ocean below was dark, choppy, and cold. And the only thing more unhelpful than Taylor's navigation was the forecast that cheerfully predicted worsening conditions. A few more transmissions trickled in. Faint, broken, almost static. And then, nothing. 5 planes, 14 men, gone into the night. It was like the sky just swallowed them. Quietly, gently, completely. Now, you'd think the United States Navy, an organization famous for being slightly dramatic when aircraft vanish, would react calmly and professionally. Absolutely not. They launched the most frantic sunset search in Florida's history. Let's float along with them. 2 massive TBM Mariner flying boats were sent out to look for the lost squadron. These were big, slow aircraft, meant to skim low over the waves like sleepy, bloated sea ducks. Sailors called them flying gas tanks, which is not exactly a nickname that inspires confidence. One of those search planes, carrying a crew of 13, took off from Banana River Naval Air Station. It flew into the growing darkness, and then it also vanished. Because of course it did. Witnesses along the coast said they saw a massive fireball far out over the water. Just a bright bloom, then silence. The Navy later concluded the Mariner probably exploded midair, something they had a habit of doing thanks to their tendency to leak fuel in the world's most flammable way. So now, the search for 14 missing men included 13 more missing men. If the story feels oddly circular, that's because it is. But let's drift further. Late that night, dozens of ships combed the sea, their lights like little floating stars. Search planes crisscrossed the sky. The Coast Guard, the Navy, random fishing boats, everyone was out there. And the ocean just stared back silently. Nothing. No debris, no oil slicks, no floating wreckage. Not even a lonely piece of wing metal politely saying, "Hi." By morning, the Atlantic looked as smooth as glass. Somewhere under that calm surface, the 5 Avengers rested, or drifted, or sank into some deep trench where light has never existed. The men aboard them, too. The Navy searched for 5 days. They found nothing. It was as if Flight 19 had simply flown out of reality. Now, let's settle deeper into the mystery by drifting toward the part where humans, being humans, started inventing explanations. Some were grounded, some were mildly ridiculous, some were impressively ridiculous. But before we get into all that, let's keep gently floating through what happened next. Later in December, the Navy put together an official investigation. They gathered transcripts, radio logs, and any statement from anyone who remotely knew how to spell airplane. They interviewed instructors, mechanics, meteorologists, and probably that one guy who delivered sandwiches to the base cafeteria. The result? An extremely long, extremely formal report concluding, the planes got lost, they ran out of fuel, they crashed. But because this was the military in 1945, they couldn't just leave it at that. They also added, the cause is unknown, which, if you think about it, feels like the investigative equivalent of shrugging your shoulders for 87 pages. But all right, We'll glide into the theories soon enough. First, let's linger a bit on the men themselves, because in a strange way, this story becomes more quietly tragic when you consider how ordinary they were. Just young aviators, some barely out of high school. Most of them were simply trying to get home by dinner time. None of them probably imagined they'd end up as one of history's most famous unsolved aviation cases. Let's flow over to that part next. Years passed, then decades, and Flight 19 became a legend. People claimed they heard phantom radio messages long after the search ended. Some said they saw ghostly aircraft near the Bahamas, always 5 of them, flying silently at twilight. Folks bansidly calling the area the Bermuda Triangle, because apparently humans can't resist branding a tragedy with a catchy name. And from there, theories multiplied like very confused rabbits. So let's gently glide into the part of the story where humans collectively shrugged, panicked a little, and then immediately started inventing explanations ranging from kind of reasonable to, "Sir, please calm down." Remember, 5 planes disappeared, then 1 rescue plane disappeared, and the ocean was in its usual unbothered way providing 0 clues. So naturally, people talked. Quietly at first, then loudly, then by the 1960s, dramatically and with very questionable book cover art. Let's drift through the theories one by one, with that soft, ironic breeze of disappointment in human reasoning. The "they just got lost" theory. Let's start with the most boring one, the one the Navy actually preferred, and honestly, the one that makes the most sense. The idea goes something like this. Taylor was already having a rough day. His compasses weren't working, or he thought they weren't working. He misidentified the islands below him. He insisted they were somewhere near the Florida Keys when they were absolutely not. He made everyone fly northeast, deeper into the open Atlantic, confidently heading in the wrong direction like a dad refusing to turn on GPS. In this version, the planes eventually ran out of fuel, sank, and now lie somewhere far, far offshore. Nothing supernatural, just bad luck, bad weather, and a tragically determined flight leader.
But people wanted more. Humans always want more, especially when something vanishes without drama. So let's float into the juicier theories. The compass failure theory. A gentle upgrade from the previous idea. Here's the thought. The compasses on Taylor's plane malfunctioned. Maybe because of electrical issues, maybe because World War II era equipment wasn't exactly known for its robust reliability, maybe because Taylor genuinely believed the compasses were lying to him even when they weren't. Either way, a compass problem in a featureless sky is basically the aviation equivalent of spinning in a closet blindfolded and trying to walk straight afterward. Not ideal. Some historians even think the sun glare caused disorientation, because nothing says high-stakes aviation like being defeated by slightly annoying weather. But again, this theory is still boring. So naturally, folks started inventing better ones. The Atlantis laser beam theory. Yes, this is real. People really said this. In the 1970s, when the Bermuda Triangle hype was at its peak and everyone apparently forgot how physics works, some absolutely enthusiastic writers claimed Atlantis, the lost city, used ancient super lasers to zap the planes into oblivion. No explanation for why Atlantis would be so grumpy. No explanation for where the lasers were installed. No explanation for how ancient underwater civilizations learned precision aircraft vaporization. But that's the theory. Atlantis, now with anti-aircraft capabilities. Let's drift on before we lose too many brain cells. The aliens took them theory. Of course, because if 5 airplanes vanish in the 1940s, it must have been extraterrestrials doing a little holiday window shopping. This theory usually goes like, aliens were observing Earth. They saw 5 identical planes flying in formation. They thought, oh, nice, a bundle pack. They vacuumed them up with a tractor beam, probably leaving the Navy very confused. This idea has no evidence, but that didn't stop it from being printed in multiple bestsellers. Honestly, if aliens really did abduct Flight 19, then they also abducted one of the search planes, because that vanished too. Which means aliens were basically doing a buy one, get one free deal that night. But let's keep drifting through the nonsense. The time warp theory. People in the 1970s had a lot of free time. This theory suggests Flight 19 flew into a time distortion, a vortex, a portal, a cosmic eddy in the fabric of space-time. Basically, a celestial washing machine that picked them up and tossed them into another century, probably without so much as a warranty. Some versions claim the planes are still flying in a loop somewhere in a different dimension, which is, aesthetically pleasing, I guess. But again, no evidence. Just vibes. The Gulf Stream stole the evidence theory. Now, this one is actually practical. It says maybe the planes did crash, but the Atlantic currents carried the wreckage far, far away before search teams even arrived. The Gulf Stream is strong, fast, and deeply uninterested in helping human investigations. It could have dragged the debris for miles, scattered it, pulled it down into impossible depths, and erased all traces long before morning. This theory actually aligns with what oceanographers say. But again, it's not spicy enough for people who prefer aliens. Let's drift onward. The Navy cover-up theory. Ah, yes, the traditional, the government is hiding something explanation. This theory claims the Navy knew exactly what happened, but covered it up because reasons. Common reasons include secret weapons, experimental aircraft, radiation, portals, or my personal favorite, classified weather, which is truly an incredible phrase. The truth is a little bit more boring. The Navy didn't hide anything. They just genuinely didn't know, which frankly is somehow worse. The human error theory. Quietly, calmly, many historians say, maybe it was just a tragic combination of things. A disoriented flight leader, inexperienced trainees, failing daylight, worsening weather, spotty radio, long distances, and low fuel. All happening at once. A perfect sad storm of misjudgments and unfortunate timing. No ghosts, no aliens, no magic triangles. Just humans doing their best in a moment when their best wasn't enough. Let's float now toward a softer, more reflective part of this story. The part where historians and ocean explorers try to fix that mystery. Because for decades, people searched. Divers, naval researchers, treasure hunters, conspiracy enthusiasts with questionable boats. Everyone wanted to find Flight 19. Spoiler, they didn't. But the attempts themselves form a strangely soothing chronicle of human stubbornness.
So after the Navy gave up in 1945 and filed their sad stack of paperwork, which probably smelled like wet socks and disappointment, the world moved on. Or tried to. But Flight 19 refused to leave people's minds. The idea of 5 planes vanishing without a trace became a kind of quiet obsession. Every so often, new rumors would surface. Someone's uncle's neighbor's cousin claimed to spot an engine in the Bahamas. A fisherman said he saw wing debris near Fort Lauderdale. A random newspaper would print a blurry photo of something metallic underwater, which turned out to be a bucket or an especially shiny rock. It was the 20th century equivalent of modern clickbait. Let's float through some of the most memorable attempts. The 1950s, the early enthusiasts, aka the good luck finding anything era. In the decade after the disappearance, the Navy occasionally returned to the search, not out of hope, but because someone higher up would say, "Hey, try looking again," and they didn't want to argue. The ocean, meanwhile, continued doing what it does best, being large, uncooperative, and full of very unhelpful fish. Nothing turned up. Not one rivet, not one lonely rubber tire, not even a mildly suspicious oil stain. Just silence. The 1960s. Jacques Cousteau-era optimism. The 60s were a magical time when people thought everything could be solved with scuba gear and a positive attitude. Ocean explorers went searching across the Bahamas. Some claimed they saw plane-shaped shadows in the blue holes. Most of these shadows turned out to be coral, rocks, or, in one memorable case, a very round whale that absolutely did not appreciate being called an airplane. Still, nothing. But the mythology? Oh, it exploded. This was when the words Bermuda Triangle really went mainstream. Suddenly, Flight 19 wasn't just a tragedy, it was proof of a supernatural region that allegedly ate ships, ate airplanes, and possibly ate the occasional overly dramatic tourist brochure. Authors wrote entire books without providing a single verifiable fact. But the public ate it up anyway. Because nothing says good bedtime reading like poorly researched ocean disappearances. The 1970s, the decade of triangle mania. If you ever want to see humans getting passionately invested in nonsense, study the 1970s. You had TV specials with ominous music, documentary hosts whispering dramatically over waves, paperback books with glowing triangles and UFOs on the cover, small-town psychics claiming the planes crossed into another realm, and one guy who insisted he dreamed the location, pointed at the wrong place, and then blamed the Navy for not checking spiritually enough. The 70s were a time. But as for actual discoveries, still nothing. The Atlantic remained the world champion of nope, not telling. The 1980s, technology joined the party. By the 80s, sonar scanning had become more advanced. Ocean researchers were optimistic. They scanned the seafloor. They mapped trenches. They pointed expensive equipment at very suspicious underwater shapes. And those shapes turned out to be old shipwrecks, reefs, rocks, more rocks, and once a wheelbarrow. Don't ask, no one knows. Flight 19 was still nowhere. Some experts began quietly saying what everyone feared: they might be too far out to ever find. But the story didn't end there, because now we float into the 1990s and 2000s, the Florida wrecks that fooled everyone. Over the years, divers found several Avenger wrecks off the Florida coast. Every time one was discovered, headlines screamed, "Flight 19 found!" And every time, the Navy checked the serial numbers and said, "Nope, different squadron, different crash. Please stop calling." It got almost comical. At one point, divers found 5 Avengers together, and the entire world leaned forward. Could it be them? Could this be the missing squadron? Spoiler? Nope. These were planes from a training accident in 1943, which also went down as a group because apparently military aviation in the 1940s had the same energy as a toddler riding a bicycle for the first time. The mystery lived on. The 2010s and beyond. Deep sea or deep nope? Modern researchers now believe Flight 19 didn't sink anywhere near the Florida coast at all. Because if Taylor flew northeast, like he kept insisting, he would have led the squadron far, far into the Atlantic. And the part of the ocean they might have ended up in, it's deep. Like, study your own mortality deep. Miles down, pitch black, filled with pressures that crush metal like tinfoil. Even modern submersibles struggle there, and the seafloor is uneven, cluttered, and big enough to hide everything from lost shipwrecks to, frankly, several small countries. The Navy's conclusion today is simple. They are gone. The ocean has them. And the ocean is not in the habit of giving things back. But here's the soft, strangely comforting truth. People still search. Every few years, a new team tries again. Someone funds a new expedition. A new sonar scan is proposed. And every time, the ocean just gazes up and says, no. But somehow, the human desire to solve the unsolvable remains. Which brings us gently to the emotional heart of the story, the men who were lost and the quiet legacy they left behind. And so, as Flight 19 drifted deeper into that invisible triangle of bad decisions and questionable navigation, something else began happening, quietly, subtly, like the universe clearing its throat before chaos. The sky above them? Yeah, that was no longer the comforting Floridian blue it had been 30 minutes earlier. It had shifted into that weird grayish-yellow color that makes you think, this feels like the prequel to a bad life choice. Lieutenant Taylor, already confused, already doubting his compass, now found himself staring at clouds that didn't belong there. Clouds that moved against the wind. Clouds that didn't drift, they crawled, like something pushing them from behind. And the men? They weren't saying it out loud because 1940s masculinity rarely allowed that, but they all had the same quiet thought. Something's wrong, and it's not just our navigation. Because right around this time, their radio static changed. Not the normal fizzing static, not the friendly psst background noise that pilots are used to. No. This static began to clip in a rhythm, like tapping, like knocking, like someone or something trying to speak through the static rather than over it. One pilot later said it reminded him of metal grinding on metal, somewhere far away, which is comforting. Exactly the kind of sound you want when you're flying over an ocean known for eating airplanes like popcorn. But here's where things get genuinely weird. Not History Channel weird, not conspiracy YouTuber weird, but genuinely recorded in Navy transcript weird. Because the last clear transmission from Flight 19 wasn't a scream, wasn't fear, wasn't even panic. It was confusion. Pure, unfiltered, baffled confusion. We are entering white water. Nothing seems right. We don't know where we are. White water. In the sky. Not the ocean below. The sky. Imagine that.
Pilots, trained professionals, suddenly reporting that the air around them looked like turning waves, like clouds bending into shapes clouds shouldn't bend into. And yes, that sounds insane. But if you know anything about the Bermuda Triangle, you know that this is kind of its whole brand. Taylor's voice had shifted now, still steady, but slower, almost like he was trying to listen to something in the background. One of the wingmen asked him something simple. "What direction should we go, sir?" And Taylor paused. For too long. If you're in the military, you do not want your commanding officer to pause that long. That's an, "oh no, we're in a documentary now" moment. Then he said, "I don't know. The ocean, it doesn't look like it should." That line, that simple sentence, it still gets historians arguing. Because what does that mean? Waves moving the wrong way? Watercolor changing? Lights below the surface? Or the uncomfortable possibility that they weren't looking at the Atlantic at all anymore? Some crew members later described the sea as dark green, glowing in sections, like something pulsing underneath. Others said the horizon had vanished entirely. No line, no separation, just a blank, endless smear. And the compasses? Dead. All of them, spinning like they were being pulled towards something magnetic, something massive, something invisible. Meanwhile, the sky kept closing in. The radio tower back at Fort Lauderdale desperately tried to guide them home. They triangulated signals. They traced bearing after bearing, and each time they thought they had Flight 19 locked in, the signal moved. Not drifted, not shifted by weather. Moved. Like the entire formation was being dragged sideways across the sky by something you can't see, can't fight, and definitely can't plot on a map. One controller later said it was as if the planes were there in the signal, then suddenly 50 miles away, then back again. The radar operators dismissed it as equipment malfunction because, when reality gets uncomfortable, we blame the tools. Meanwhile, up in the air, the men were running out of fuel. Taylor's last known instruction was quiet, resigned, calm in a way that made it worse. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all ditched together. A chilling sentence, because everyone knew what ditching meant in those seas. Best case, you survive the landing. Worst case, you vanish into waters where even the Navy can't find you. And they were still reporting strange lights. Lights under the ocean, lights above the cloud line, lights moving in patterns that didn't match aircraft, storms, or anything human. Then finally, the last message, a whisper, barely readable, almost swallowed by static. Everything looked strange, even the ocean. And then, silence. Not static, not fading, just nothing. Like someone had flipped the Bermuda Triangle's favorite switch. And for a long moment, that silence felt heavier than the ocean itself. Like the triangle had taken a deep breath and held it. Back at the control tower, the operators waited. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, a minute. Nothing. They tried calling again. FT-28, this is Fort Lauderdale. Do you read? Silence. FT-28, any aircraft in Flight 19, please respond. More silence, the kind that creeps under your skin like cold water. Finally, one operator took off his headset and muttered the words nobody else wanted to say. They're gone. No one replied, because everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. There is a difference between radio loss and disappearance, and this felt like the latter.
But the night wasn't done being strange. At 7:27 p.m., the Navy launched a TBM Mariner, a giant rescue aircraft, to search for Flight 19. You'd think sending out a rescue plane would help the situation. But the Triangle said, "Oh, you brought another one. How thoughtful." Because the Mariner didn't even last 20 minutes. A ship in the area reported seeing a massive orange explosion in the sky, a fireball so bright sailors shielded their eyes. They rushed to the coordinates, found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no smoke, not even a single piece of metal floating on the water. 20 more men, gone. Just added to the tab. The search that found nothing. For the next 5 days, the Navy launched one of the largest search missions in U.S. history. 300-plus planes, 13 ships, thousands of square miles. And after all that effort, all that fuel burned, all those hours logged, they found exactly nothing. No life rafts, no floating wreckage, no bodies, no clue. It was as if the ocean had swallowed everything whole and then politely wiped its mouth. The official explanation that convinces no one. Months later, the Navy released its conclusion. Cause of disappearance? Unknown. One investigator, clearly tired of pretending everything made sense, wrote the now famous line, "They vanished as if they had flown to Mars." Not exactly the kind of sentence you want in a government document, but the truth was impossible to hide. The compasses didn't just fail, they acted impossible. The radio signals didn't just weaken, they moved. The ocean didn't just look strange, it looked wrong. And trained pilots didn't just get lost. They sounded like men staring at something they couldn't explain. Even today, historians debate it, skeptics dismiss it, and believers say, "See, told you so." But no theory fits cleanly. Not weather, not pilot error, not fuel, not storms, not equipment malfunction. Nothing explains the glowing water they described. Nothing explains the shape-shifting horizon. Nothing explains the lights above and below. Nothing explains the rescue plane vanishing too. Nothing explains how 6 aircraft disappeared in the same place on the same night without leaving behind a single trace. And so the ending isn't really an ending. People still claim, even now, that on calm nights, deep-sea microphones pick up faint engine sounds far below the Atlantic, too rhythmic to be whales, too mechanical to be natural, too distant to identify. Some say it's nothing. Some say it's Flight 19, still flying, trapped somewhere out of reach, like echoes from a place where time folds wrong. And maybe that's the truth of the Bermuda Triangle. It doesn't steal things. It keeps them. Like a museum of mistakes tucked beneath the waves. What happened to Flight 19? Nobody knows. But their last message lingers. Everything looks strange, even the ocean. And for the rest of history, everything stayed strange. Because unlike most mysteries, this one didn't end with answers. It ended with silence. And then the Bermuda Triangle, silence is the loudest thing of all.